My parents didn't know I had written it. They didn't know I was a journalist. Not really. Not in the way that would have let them understand what that meant. They knew I wrote things the way they knew I did accounting, as a vague professional category that had never been important enough to investigate further. You'll ruin our image. In 3 weeks, I thought, you have no idea. To understand the shape of my family, you need to understand what image meant to my parents. My father, William, built his professional identity around civic presence. He sat on 3 non-profit boards. He was a regular donor to the kind of causes that got your name on plaques in lobbies. He attended the right events, knew the right people, and had cultivated, over 20 years, the reputation of a man of standing in his community. That reputation was not performance exactly. He genuinely believed in some of what he supported, but the reputation was also, unmistakably, the point. The substance and the image had become so entangled in his mind that I'm not sure he could have separated them even if he'd tried. My mother, Carol, managed the social dimension of that reputation with the same precision she brought to everything. She knew who was important and why, what events required attendance, what relationships needed maintenance, what impressions needed managing. She was good at it. The anniversary party was, in miniature, what she was best at. A carefully constructed occasion that would reflect well on both of them and be remembered correctly by the right people. I was not part of that image, not because I had done anything wrong, not because I was difficult or unstable or the family scandal. I was not part of the image because I was inconvenient to it, because I had opinions I did not always soften, because I asked questions at dinner tables that my father's colleagues sometimes found uncomfortable, because I had, on more than one occasion, said something honest in a room that preferred polished, because the version of a daughter that fit my parents' image was a version I had never been. I want to give you a specific example because I think the pattern is clearer in particulars than in generalizations. 3 years before the party, my parents had hosted a charity gala at their house. 40 guests, catered, the kind of evening that required significant preparation and produced significant social capital. I had been invited to that one. I was living in the city by then, and excluding me entirely from a home event would have raised questions my mother didn't want to answer. I had been careful. I had worn the right dress and said the right things and performed the version of myself that caused the least friction. And then, near the end of the evening, one of my father's foundation colleagues had made a comment about a grant decision offhand, not expecting to be challenged. That was factually incorrect in a way that mattered. I had said so. Politely, specifically, with the sourced correction rather than just the disagreement. The colleague had not been pleased. My father had given me a look across the room that I had learned to read years earlier. The look that said, "You have done the thing again, and we will discuss it later." Later, my mother had said, "You know how important these relationships are to your father." I had said, "He was wrong about the grant." She had said, "That's not the point." I had thought, "Then what is?" That was the architecture of my exclusion, not malice. Just the consistent, practiced prioritization of impression over accuracy, of relationship maintenance over truth, of image over everything. Including me. My sister Melissa fit. She was warm and social and said the right things at the right moments, and had married a man my father liked and lived in a neighborhood my mother approved of. She was in the language of my parents' world, an asset. She had been invited to the party. She was, as far as I knew, helping plan it. "And you found out when everyone else did." Another silence, longer. She said, "The reporter who called the foundation, that was you." I said, "The queries went through my editors." "But yes, that was my reporting." She said, "Your father is." She stopped, started again. "He's devastated." I said, "He had the opportunity to respond. He responded." She said, "He didn't know it was you." I said, "No, he didn't." She said, "How could you do this to him?" And there it was. The question I had known was coming, not, "How did we get here?" Not, "What did we miss about you?" How could you do this to him? The family logic, intact and operational. Whatever happened, the fault line ran through me. I said, "Mom," I reported a story that was true and fair and in the public interest. I gave everyone named in it the opportunity to respond. I did my job. And I did it in a city where my family lives. covering a community my family is part of, because that's where I am and that's what I do. If you want to ask why I didn't warn you personally, I think you know the answer to that, she said. The party. I said, the party. And the 20 years before it. My father did not call that day. He called 3 days later, when the immediate chaos of the Foundation's response had settled into the slower, more manageable process of a governance review that would take months to resolve. His call was short and careful, the call of a man who had spent 3 days thinking about what to say, and had arrived at something honest but compressed. He said, "I didn't know you were that kind of journalist." I said, "You didn't know what kind of journalist I was." He said, "That's true." I waited, he said. The story was fair. I've read it 4 times. The questions were legitimate. I should have been asking them myself. That last sentence surprised me, not because it was generous. It wasn't particularly generous, it was just accurate, but because it was the first time in my memory that my father had applied his standards to himself in a conversation with me rather than away from it. I said, "Yeah, you should have." He said, I'm not calling to ask you to take it back. I'm calling because I think I need to understand something." I waited. He said, "Did you take this assignment because of our family? Was this personal?" It was the question I had asked myself most often during the 8 months of reporting. I had sat with it at every stage of the process. I had answered it honestly to my editors, who had asked it too, as they should have. I said, "The story came to me because of a tip from a source who had nothing to do with our family. I pursued it because the questions it raised were real and mattered. The fact that you were on that board was something I disclosed to my editors when I discovered it, and they decided the reporting was sound enough to proceed with appropriate oversight. So no, it wasn't personal. But I also didn't pull my punches because it was you. That would have been worse." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's the right answer," I said. "I know." He said, "I didn't come to your graduation." The sentence arrived without context, disconnected from what we had been discussing, dropped into the conversation the way old things sometimes surface when a wall has been cracked. Not through the crack that was made intentionally, but through the ones that were always there. I said, "No." "You had a board dinner." He said, "I had a board dinner for a foundation I now understand was not being run correctly." I said nothing. He said, "I missed a lot of things." I said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know if I can fix that." I said, "I don't know either. But this is the first conversation we've had in years where you weren't trying to manage how I came across. So that's something." He said, "I'm going to try. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm going to try." That sentence, "I don't know what that looks like yet," was the most honest thing about it. Because the people who say I'll do better without knowing what better requires are usually just managing you again. But the people who say I don't know what it looks like yet, but I'm going to try, those people are at least starting from an accurate place. They are at least refusing to pretend the answer is simple. I told him I heard him. I told him trying was where it had to start. I told him that a relationship between us that was real rather than managed was something I actually wanted. Not because I needed his approval, but because he was my father and I had spent a long time missing the version of him that asked questions instead of controlling answers. He didn't say much to that, but he didn't deflect either. He just said, "Okay," and we stayed on the phone for another few minutes, talking about nothing in particular, in the slightly awkward way of people who are rebuilding something and haven't yet found their footing. It was a start. The foundation launched its review. 2 board members resigned. My father did not resign, he stayed, which his lawyer advised and which I thought was the right choice, because staying and participating in the review was more accountable than leaving. My mother and I had several more conversations. They were slow and sometimes halting and occasionally reverted to the old patterns before catching themselves. But they were conversations. Real ones, the kind where both people are actually present rather than performing presence. She said, in one of them, something I have thought about many times since, "I think I always knew you were doing something serious. I just didn't ask, because asking meant I had to adjust the story I was telling about you, and adjusting the story felt like admitting the story had been wrong." I said, "It had been wrong." She said, "I know. I'm sorry." I was afraid you'd ask the wrong question or challenge the wrong person, I said. Right, she said. I didn't understand that asking the wrong question and challenging the wrong person was literally your profession. I said, no, you didn't. She said, if I had known, really known what you did, I would have been afraid for a completely different reason. She laughed a little when she said it, a small, rueful laugh, the laugh of someone who has found the irony in their own situation. I laughed too, because it was genuinely ironic. They had kept me away from the party to protect the image. The story had affected the image far more than my presence at a catered dinner ever could have. And the story existed, in part, because I was a journalist who had grown up watching the gap between image and truth in exactly the kind of environment my parents moved in, and had decided to spend my career documenting it. They had shaped me into exactly the thing they were afraid of. They just hadn't known what they were shaping, she said. I'm proud of you, for the work, even though it was hard. I'm proud of you. First time. In direct response to something specific I had done that she understood and was reckoning with honestly, not the generic parental formality. The real version. I said, thank you, Mom. I meant every word. My mother and I had several more conversations. They were slow and sometimes halting and occasionally reverted to the old patterns before catching themselves. But they were conversations. Real ones. The kind where both people are actually present rather than performing presence. She said in one of them, something that I have thought about many times since. I think I always knew you were doing something serious. I didn't ask. Because asking meant I had to adjust the story I was telling about you. And adjusting the story felt like admitting the story had been wrong. I said, it had been wrong. She said, I know. I'm sorry. Melissa, my sister, called the week after the story ran. Her call was the one I had been most uncertain about, because Melissa and I had a complicated history that was different from my history with my parents, not the history of a favoured child and an overlooked one, but the history of two people who had grown up in the same house and made very different choices about how to navigate it. Melissa had chosen accommodation. I had chosen distance. Neither of us had chosen honesty, which meant we had never really known each other. She said, I had no idea you were working on this. I said, I know. She said, Mom and Dad are shaken. I said, I know that too. She said, was it? Did you plan this? The timing with the party. I said the publication date was set by my editors weeks before the party conversation happened. I didn't plan the timing. She was quiet. Then would you have warned them if they had invited you? It was the honest question, the one that required an honest answer. I said I would have told them I was working on something that involved the foundation. I would have given them more time to prepare. But I would have published it. She said, okay, a pause. I think I understand. She said, I should have noticed what was happening with you. For a long time, I was too busy being the one who fit to look at what it cost you not to. That was the most honest thing Melissa had ever said to me. And it came, like so many honest things, from a moment of crisis that had cracked open the comfortable version of events and left the real one visible. The reporter who had called the foundation board to request comment, who had, through my editors, sent the questions that ultimately came back to my father. That reporter had asked for me specifically, not by name, because she hadn't known my name yet, but in the follow-up to the foundation's initial statement. When my editors sent a second round of questions, the communications director had written back asking who the lead reporter was, because the board wanted to understand the scope of what was being investigated. My editor had written back with my name. The communications director had passed it to my father. My father had Googled me. And he had seen 7 years of published work, stories in local and regional publications, a prize for an investigative series on housing policy. The bio page on my magazine's website that listed my beat as civic accountability and institutional oversight in regional communities. He'd seen all of it, years of it. Sitting there, searchable and real and completely unknown to him. He told me this on the phone in that careful call 3 days after publication. He said, I Googled you when they told me your name. I found everything you've written. I said, okay. He said, you've been doing this for 7 years. I said, yes. He said, I didn't know. You didn't. He said, That's on me. 3 words. That's on me. The most accountable sentence my father had ever directed at me. Undecorated, unqualified his, I said, yes, it is. And we sat with that together. In the phone, in the particular silence of 2 people who have finally stopped moving around a truth and are standing directly in front of it. Here is what I want to say to anyone who has been told, in one way or another, that their presence is a problem. That they are too much or not enough, or simply the wrong kind of person for the room their family is trying to construct. You are not required to shrink to fit the frame. The frame is not the truth. The frame is a choice someone made, usually a long time ago, usually without examining it, usually because it was easier than asking the harder questions about who you actually are and what you are actually capable of. I did not set out to expose my father. I set out to do serious work in a city I knew well, on a topic that mattered, with the tools and skills and discipline I had spent 7 years developing. The fact that the work intersected with my family was a consequence of geography and subject matter, and honestly, of spending my career asking questions about exactly the kind of institutions my family had always participated in without questioning. The work was not personal, but the context was. And I think that context, growing up in a family that treated image as more important than truth, that managed appearances more carefully than relationships, that could exclude a daughter from an anniversary party in the name of reputation. I think that context shaped the kind of journalist I became. It gave me a specific sensitivity to the gap between how institutions present themselves and what they actually are. It gave me patience for the long, slow work of tracing that gap back to its source. Some things your family teaches you without meaning to. The question is what you do with the lesson. The anniversary party happened without me. My parents celebrated 25 years in a room full of the right people, with the video my sister had made, and the catered dinner, and the carefully managed impression they had worked so hard to maintain. The story ran 3 weeks later, and the week after that, a reporter from a regional outlet called the Foundation Board and asked to speak with a journalist who had broken the story. They wanted a follow-up comment. They wanted to talk to the person who had done the reporting. They asked for me by name. My editor passed along the message. I called back that afternoon, sitting at my desk in the city where I had grown up. In the career I'd built in the years, my family had spent not asking about it. And I answered the reporter's questions with the same precision I brought to everything. They asked who I was. I told them. Not the polished version, not the managed version, not the version calibrated to fit into the image someone else had decided I belonged in. The real version, all of it, exactly as large as it actually was. So tell me, has someone in your life ever told you that you were too much for the room, and then discovered too late that the room was too small for what you actually were? Because if they have, I want you to say something. You were never the problem. You were just bigger than the frame they built. And eventually, when the work is real and the truth is documented,